It is February 1945, and deep inside the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, a toxic rumor is rapidly spreading. Whispers echo through the corridors that British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery is actively lobbying to fire the commander of the United States Ninth Army. The alleged target is General William Simpson, a towering, famously soft-spoken American who almost never loses his temper. Simpson's army is locked in massive preparations for the critical push to the Rhine River, yet his temporary British boss supposedly wants him gone. It seems entirely inexplicable. Why would Montgomery try to sack arguably the most efficient, cooperative, and least problematic American general in the entire European theater? The answer lies at the dangerous intersection of coalition politics, national pride, and deeply contrasting command cultures. As the Allied forces prepared for the final, decisive drive into Germany, the struggle at the highest echelons was no longer solely against the Wehrmacht. It was a bitter, high-stakes battle for prestige and the power to dictate the narrative of the war's final days. We will investigate the reality behind this explosive rumor. Did Field Marshal Montgomery genuinely attempt to sabotage Simpson's career to guarantee British operational dominance over the prestigious Rhine crossing? Or is this narrative a post-war distortion, fueled by the fierce rivalries and bruised egos of competing American commanders like Omar Bradley? To understand how a quiet, meticulously competent American general became the epicenter of a transatlantic power struggle, we must retrace the operational timeline. The seeds of this command crisis were not planted on the banks of the Rhine. To find them, we have to step back into the freezing fog, the severed communication lines, and the absolute chaos of the Ardennes offensive, where this entire jurisdictional nightmare first began. Late December 1944, the freezing, fog-choked forests of the Ardennes. The German army launches a desperate, massive winter counteroffensive that tears a 60-mile-wide gap directly through the American lines. This is the Battle of the Bulge, and it instantly shatters the Allied operational structure. As German panzers push westward, they effectively sever the Allied front in two, cutting crucial communication cables and road networks. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, assessing the situation maps back at headquarters in Versailles, realizes a grim logistical truth. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American 12th Army Group from his command post in the south, is now physically and electronically cut off from his northernmost forces. To prevent a catastrophic collapse of command and control, Eisenhower makes a drastic, purely pragmatic decision. On December 20th, he redraws the map. He temporarily strips the United States First Army, commanded by Courtney Hodges, and the United States Ninth Army, commanded by William Simpson, away from Bradley. He hands them over to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's British 21st Army Group, positioned on the northern shoulder of the German breakthrough. It is intended as a temporary emergency measure to stabilize the line, but in the highly charged, ego-driven atmosphere of coalition warfare, this pragmatic shift registers as a profound national insult. The transfer forces two radically different military cultures into a cramped, high-pressure space. The American command philosophy, championed by leaders like Bradley and George S. Patton, is built on aggressive improvisation, fluid mobility, and seizing fleeting tactical opportunities. They favor maintaining relentless, continuous pressure across a broad front. The British approach, perfectly embodied by Montgomery, is the polar opposite. Scarred by the staggering manpower losses of the First World War, and acutely aware that the British Empire is running critically low on replacement infantry, British doctrine prioritizes extreme caution and the conservation of lives. Montgomery demands methodical, meticulously planned, and heavily resourced set-piece battles. He wants overwhelming artillery, concentrated logistics, and absolute control before a single rifleman moves forward. To the British High Command, the Americans often appear reckless, disorganized, and in desperate need of strict centralized supervision. To the Americans, Montgomery is agonizingly slow, arrogant, and overly obsessed with hoarding divisions for massive plotting operations. The tension detonates publicly in early January 1945. With the German offensive contained, Montgomery holds a press conference. Through a combination of tactless phrasing and supreme self-confidence, he leaves the international press with the distinct impression that he had personally ridden to the rescue of the disorganized Americans, saving them from total disaster. British newspapers amplify the narrative. Omar Bradley is furious, privately threatening Eisenhower with his resignation if he is forced to serve under Montgomery permanently. Recognizing the toxic political fallout, Eisenhower quickly returns the First Army to Bradley's control as the bulge is reduced. But then, Eisenhower makes a strategic calculation that infuriates the American top brass all over again. He does not return General William Simpson's Ninth Army. Instead, he leaves it firmly attached to Montgomery's 21st Army Group for the critical spring offensives. This is no minor slight. The Ninth Army is not a small detachment. It is a massive, highly mechanized, rapidly expanding force that will soon swell to over 300,000 men. By leaving it under the British flag, Eisenhower ensures that the main thrust into Germany, the prestigious northern crossing of the Rhine River, designed to encircle the industrial heartland of the Ruhr, will be commanded by a British field marshal, largely using American troops, American armor, and American logistics. For Bradley and his loyalists, this is a bitter pill. They feel sidelined, convinced that Montgomery is using American blood and steel to secure British post-war glory, while treating American generals as subordinates, incapable of independent strategic thought. Montgomery, conversely, believes he is simply employing the necessary mass to guarantee a decisive victory without taking unnecessary risks. He views the Ninth Army not as a political prize, but as an essential tool to smash the final German defenses. Caught squarely in the center of this transatlantic venom is General William Simpson. A towering, bald, soft-spoken officer, Simpson must prepare his massive army for a violent eastward thrust, while navigating the bruised egos of his American peers and the exacting, rigid demands of his temporary British commander. The resentment inside the American command tents is reaching a critical boiling point. The fragile Allied coalition is severely strained, and the tension is about to violently snap. But the trigger will not be a harsh command from Montgomery, nor another protest from Bradley. It will be a sudden, catastrophic act of environmental warfare that will stop the Ninth Army dead in its tracks. In early February 1945, the advancing Americans hit a literal wall of water. Recognizing that they could not hold the western approaches by force alone, German engineers deliberately blew the discharge valves of the Schwamenow Dam. Millions of gallons of freezing water violently surged down the Roer River valley. Within hours, a manageable river transformed into a raging, impassable lake over a mile wide in some sectors. The Ninth Army's highly anticipated offensive was completely paralyzed. They had no choice but to halt in the freezing mud and wait for the floodwaters to recede. This agonizing 2-week operational pause created a dangerous vacuum. Idle time in a tense coalition breeds toxic paranoia, and back at rear echelon headquarters, the rumor mill went into overdrive. Fanned by the lingering bitterness of the Ardennes, whispers spread like wildfire among American officers. Montgomery considered the United States Ninth Army staff hopelessly inadequate. The gossip claimed the Field Marshal was actively looking for an excuse to fire General William Simpson and replace him with a British commander to lead the main thrust into Germany. The narrative fit perfectly with the deep-seated American fear of being sidelined in their own war. But when we peel back the layers of headquarters gossip and examine the official operational records from February 1945, a jarringly different reality emerges. Behind closed doors, Montgomery was not plotting a coup against Simpson. He was doing the exact opposite. He was quietly handing the American general one of the most formidable arsenals assembled on the Western Front. Instead of replacing American staff, Montgomery demonstrated immense material trust in Simpson's operational competence. He funneled massive logistical resources into the Ninth Army's sector, deliberately swelling Simpson's command. Furthermore, he attached British units, heavily reinforcing the Americans with specialized British armor and vast artillery concentrations to guarantee a breakthrough. Montgomery, a man infamous for his micromanagement and his lack of faith in American leadership, was actually staking the success of the entire Northern campaign on Simpson's shoulders. The rumors of an impending firing were completely detached from the logistical reality on the ground. Simpson was not on the verge of being sacked. He was being armed to the teeth. He now commanded a colossal, hybrid Anglo-American juggernaut. But as the violent floodwaters of the Roer finally began to drop, a new, critical test loomed. Simpson had the men and the guns, but he still had to prove that American tactical speed could function without shattering inside Field Marshal Montgomery's rigid, meticulously controlled master plan. The Roer River, swollen to a violent, murky torrent by the shattered German dams, was slowly beginning to recede by the third week of February 1945. But the intellectual and cultural divide separating the Allied command tents remained as wide and treacherous as the water itself. To understand the immense pressure resting on the shoulders of General William H. Simpson, one must look at how the American and British armies actually functioned as industrial and tactical organizations. By early 1945, the American Expeditionary Forces under General Omar Bradley had evolved into a fast, aggressive, and highly decentralized military machine. Commanders like George S. Patton and Courtney Hodges operated on the principle of maximum forward momentum. The American doctrine relied on armored cavalry, probing deep into enemy lines, establishing contact, and then improvising rapid, violent solutions on the move. They accepted high logistical risks, stretched their supply lines to the breaking point, and viewed a chaotic, fluid battlefield as an opportunity for rapid exploitation. If an American armored division found a weak spot, they pushed through it immediately, expecting the logistical tail to catch up later. Conversely, the British 21st Army Group, commanded by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, functioned under an entirely different operational philosophy. Montgomery abhorred the chaotic, ad hoc nature of American armored pursuits. His doctrine was shaped by the brutal, attritional warfare of the First World War, and the stark reality that the British Empire was facing an acute, irreversible manpower crisis. Montgomery could not afford to lose whole divisions in reckless lunges. He demanded what he called a tidy battlefield. This meant absolute, centralized control. Before a British offensive launched, Montgomery required colossal, meticulously calculated stockpiles of artillery ammunition, fuel, and bridging equipment. His battle plans were constructed around rigid, sequential phase lines. An army advanced to a specific geographic point, halted, brought up its artillery, consolidated its logistics, and only then launched the next carefully scripted phase. To Montgomery, the American method looked like undisciplined chaos. To the Americans, Montgomery's method looked like agonizing, paralyzing timidity. Thrown squarely into the center of this toxic, polarized environment was the United States Ninth Army. To survive under Montgomery's command without alienating his own American peers, William Simpson had to become a flawless military diplomat. A tall, impeccably dressed officer with a completely bald head and an unusually calm demeanor, Simpson lacked the explosive, headline-grabbing ego of Patton or the prickly defensiveness of Bradley. He recognized a fundamental truth about coalition warfare that his colleagues often ignored. Montgomery responded to compliance, not confrontation. Rather than fighting the British Field Marshal over strategic control, Simpson actively absorbed the friction. He regularly traveled to Montgomery's tactical headquarters, listening intently to the Field Marshal's lengthy, lecturing monologues, without interrupting or challenging his authority. When Montgomery handed down a rigid, highly phased operational directive that dictated exactly how the Ninth Army should fight, Simpson accepted it graciously. Then, he drove back to his own headquarters in Maastricht, gathered his American Corps commanders, men like Raymond McLean of the 19th Corps and Alvin Gillum of the 13th Corps, and effectively translated the British directives into American operational language. He gave Montgomery the detailed logistical reports and phased maps the Field Marshal demanded, creating the illusion of absolute, centralized control. But underneath that bureaucratic umbrella, Simpson quietly afforded his American commanders the tactical flexibility they needed to move fast. He was building a shock absorber between two clashing military cultures, preparing to execute a massive offensive known as Operation Grenade. Across the receding waters of the Roer, the German military apparatus was conducting its own deeply flawed analysis of the impending Allied strike. The German 15th Army, commanded by General Gustav Adolf von Zangen, was dug into the eastern bank of the river. Behind them lay the flat, open plains of the Rhineland, the last natural barrier before the industrial heart of the Reich. Zangen and the intelligence officers of the German High Command knew that Field Marshal Montgomery was the overarching architect of the Northern Allied Front. The German General Staff had been studying Montgomery since the deserts of North Africa. They believed they thoroughly understood his operational signature. German intelligence files characterized the British Field Marshal as a methodical, predictable commander who relied exclusively on overwhelming material superiority. The German assessment concluded that any attack launched under Montgomery's flag would follow a standard, recognizable pattern: a prolonged, multi-day artillery bombardment, followed by a slow, heavily supported infantry advance that would halt repeatedly to secure its flanks. Operating on this assumption, the German 15th Army deployed its forces to counter a sluggish, grinding British offensive. They placed their infantry divisions in the forward trench lines along the Roer, but they held their critical mobile reserves, including the mechanized elements of the Panzer Grenadier divisions, miles to the rear. The German logic was mathematically sound based on their assessment of Montgomery. Once the British began their slow crossing, the German reserves would have days to identify the main effort, organize counterattacks, and contain the bridgeheads before any serious breakout could occur. What the German intelligence apparatus fundamentally failed to calculate was the American element operating beneath the British strategic umbrella. They were preparing for a British set-piece battle. They were entirely unprepared for the brutal, high-speed tactical aggression of the United States Ninth Army. By February 22, 1945, the Roer River floodwaters had finally subsided enough to make an assault technically possible, though highly dangerous. The river was still swollen, running at a treacherous current of nearly 6 to 8 feet per second, heavily laden with debris. The muddy banks were heavily mined and zeroed in by German mortar teams. Field Marshal Montgomery gave the green light. Now, Simpson had to execute. At 2:45 in the morning on February 23rd, the silence over the Roer Valley was shattered by one of the most intense artillery barrages of the European war. Simpson, honoring Montgomery's demand for overwhelming firepower, unleashed a synchronized hurricane bombardment from over 2,000 American artillery pieces. For 45 minutes, a solid wall of high explosives pummeled the German defensive positions, severing communications and burying bunkers. But as the barrage lifted, Simpson immediately injected American speed into the equation. He did not wait for daylight. At 3:30 in the pitch black of the early morning, the American assault battalions of the 29th and 30th Infantry Divisions pushed their canvas and plywood assault boats into the raging, freezing water. The crossing was chaotic and brutal. The sheer velocity of the Roer River caught the flat-bottomed craft, spinning them wildly downstream. Mooring cables snapped under the immense pressure of the current. German machine gun positions that had survived the bombardment opened fire, tracing deadly arcs of tracer fire across the water. Dozens of boats capsized, dragging heavily laden American infantrymen into the freezing depths. But the sheer momentum of the Ninth Army assault could not be contained. Pushing through the friction and the casualties, the American infantry clawed their way onto the eastern bank, neutralizing the forward German defenses through close-quarters combat. Within hours, as the sun rose over the muddy valley, the true mechanical might of the Ninth Army came into play. American combat engineers, working under direct, lethal German mortar fire, began wrestling heavy pontoon bridges and steel treadways across the violent river. Despite taking heavy losses, the engineers had the first vehicular bridges operational by the evening of the first day. This was the critical inflection point of Operation Grenade. Under British doctrine, the next step would have been a deliberate operational pause. A British commander would likely have pushed 2 or 3 miles inland, halted the infantry, spent 48 hours dragging artillery across the river, established a massive logistical dump on the eastern bank, and only then prepared for Phase 2. Simpson completely discarded this methodical approach. The moment his engineers secured the treadway bridges, he began shoving his heavy armor, specifically the highly mobile 2nd and 8th Armored Divisions, directly across the Roer and straight into the German rear. Simpson unleashed his corps commanders, ordering them to drive relentlessly toward the Rhine, bypass isolated German strongpoints, and shatter the enemy's command and control. The Ninth Army exploded out of the bridgeheads, transitioning instantly from a deliberate river crossing into a devastating armored pursuit. American Sherman tanks and half-tracks poured across the flat German plains, operating exactly as Bradley and Patton would have demanded, moving fast, accepting exposed flanks, and violently exploiting the chaos. Back at the headquarters of the German 15th Army, the realization of what was happening triggered absolute systemic panic. The intelligence assumptions of the German High Command completely disintegrated. The reports flooding into General von Zangen's command post described an enemy moving at an impossible speed. The expected slow, methodical British advance had materialized as a terrifying, mechanized American blitzkrieg. Before the German generals could even mobilize their armored reserves from the rear, American tank columns were already tearing through their assembly areas. The German defensive grid was hopelessly outpaced. Communication nodes were overrun before orders could be issued. German infantry units, attempting to fall back to secondary defensive lines, found American armored cavalry already sitting across their escape routes. The 15th Army was not just being pushed back, it was being systematically dismantled from the inside out. Within a week, the 9th Army had driven more than 50 miles, capturing the major industrial hub of Mönchengladbach ahead of any projected schedule. They linked up seamlessly with the Canadian 1st Army pushing down from the north, trapping thousands of retreating German soldiers in a massive steel vise. By the first week of March, William Simpson's forces had reached the western banks of the Rhine River. The butcher's bill for the Wehrmacht was catastrophic. The 9th Army had captured over 30,000 German soldiers, annihilated the 15th Army's defensive capabilities, and secured the vital staging grounds for the final invasion of Germany. The operation was an unmitigated, staggering success. Field Marshal Montgomery was, characteristically, stunned but deeply impressed. Simpson had operated under his command, utilized British logistical support, and executed a massive theater-level offensive without a single major tactical error. He had successfully merged the overwhelming material preparation of the British military culture with the ruthless, high-speed execution of the American armored doctrine. It was the absolute pinnacle of what the Allied coalition could achieve when managed correctly. Simpson had just delivered a masterpiece of coalition warfare, tearing the German front to pieces and proving beyond any doubt that an American army could function flawlessly under a British field marshal. But back at the Supreme Allied headquarters, and in the private command trailers of generals like Omar Bradley, Simpson's spectacular battlefield victory was rapidly metastasizing. The Ninth Army's flawless performance had not soothed the bruised egos of the American top brass. It had inflamed them. Simpson had fought too well under the wrong flag, and his battlefield success was becoming a massive political problem. When we strip away decades of post-war mythology, the explosive rumor that Field Marshal Montgomery actively lobbied to fire General Simpson completely collapses. A close examination of declassified Allied communications reveals that the demand for Simpson's removal was almost entirely a fabrication. It was a narrative manufactured long after the guns fell silent, heavily amplified by the bitter, self-serving memoirs of Montgomery's American rivals, who were desperate to dictate the history of the European theater. In reality, the rigidly demanding British commander had found his ideal American counterpart. Private dispatches sent from Montgomery's tactical headquarters back to the War Office in London paint a jarringly different picture from the public feuds. In highly classified assessments, Montgomery explicitly praised Simpson's operational brilliance, highlighting his meticulous professionalism and his refreshing lack of ego. Montgomery did not want to fire the commander of the Ninth Army. He considered him the most dependable American general in the field. The actual transatlantic crisis was never about Simpson's competence. It was entirely about optics. As the casualty lists grew, the intense resentment within Omar Bradley's camp reached a dangerous boiling point over a very specific grievance. A British field marshal was consistently taking the international headlines, while American armored columns and American infantry won the actual battles. The command clash was not born of military necessity, but of bruised nationalistic pride and the desperate need to secure a post-war legacy. By the middle of March 1945, the political pressure bearing down on Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower from Washington was absolute. He had to reclaim the Ninth Army to satisfy the American public and pacify his furious senior generals. But extracting Simpson from British control could not happen immediately. Before that geopolitical maneuver could be finalized, the quiet American general had one last massive operation to execute. That final operation was the crossing of the Rhine River, the last great natural barrier protecting the German heartland. Scheduled for the final week of March 1945, Operation Plunder was designed to be Field Marshal Montgomery's crowning achievement. True to his doctrine, Montgomery orchestrated a spectacle of staggering, almost theatrical proportions. He spent weeks massing over 1 million men, hoarding immense stockpiles of bridging equipment, and deploying massive smoke generators to shroud the riverbanks. He even insisted on a colossal daylight airborne armada, Operation Varsity, dropping 2 full airborne divisions directly over the eastern bank to secure the high ground. It was a heavily rehearsed, highly publicized maneuver, guaranteed to dominate the international press. But on the southern flank of this massive Anglo-American staging area, General William Simpson's Ninth Army approached the obstacle with a totally different mindset. Tasked with executing Operation Flashpoint, the American component of the crossing, Simpson completely bypassed the theater. He did not require a sprawling airborne drop to secure his immediate front. Instead, he relied on the aggressive, decentralized efficiency he had spent months perfecting beneath the British radar. At 0200 hours on March 24th, with minimal fanfare and ruthless precision, Simpson sent his assault regiments silently slipping across the dark waters of the Rhine in motorized storm boats. The contrast in execution was jarring. While the highly publicized airborne drops to the north suffered intense, concentrated casualties from waiting German anti-aircraft fire, Simpson's infantry seized their initial bridgeheads with stunning speed. Within hours, American combat engineers were once again driving steel pilings into the riverbed. By nightfall, the Ninth Army had firmly established a massive, heavily reinforced footprint on the eastern bank, incurring remarkably light losses. Once the heavy treadway bridges were locked into place, Simpson did exactly what he had done at the Roer. He instantly transitioned from a deliberate crossing to a high-speed mechanized pursuit. He unleashed his armored columns. The 2nd Armored Division surged out of the bridgehead and hit the open expanses of the North German plain. German resistance, shattered by the crossing and hopelessly outmaneuvered, began to disintegrate. Simpson's mechanized forces were suddenly operating in a tactician's dream. Wide open terrain, fleeing enemy remnants, and a clear, high-speed corridor leading straight east. By the second week of April, Simpson's forward tanks had reached the banks of the Elbe River. They were less than 60 miles from Berlin. The Autobahn to the capital of the Third Reich was effectively wide open, and the Ninth Army possessed the logistical momentum to take it. Simpson had achieved absolute operational perfection. But just as his tank commanders requested permission to make the final historic drive into the city, the immovable wall of Allied politics finally intercepted them. The geopolitical hammer was about to drop. The geopolitical hammer that dropped was not just the order to halt at the Elbe and leave Berlin to the Red Army. It was the final, decisive restructuring of the Allied coalition. Just days earlier, on April 4th, 1945, the Supreme Political Balancing Act had reached its conclusion. After the Ninth Army executed a massive southern hook to link up with the First Army, effectively sealing the sprawling Ruhr pocket and trapping more than 300,000 German soldiers, Eisenhower made his move. He abruptly severed William Simpson's command from Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group and handed the entire Ninth Army back to Omar Bradley. In a single administrative stroke, the transatlantic political equilibrium was restored. Montgomery was stripped of his mechanized American spearhead just weeks before the final surrender, and Bradley finally reclaimed his stolen army. When the dust of the European theater finally settled, the explosive headquarters rumor of a vicious British plot to sack an American general completely dissolved into the harsh reality of coalition warfare. The documentary record proves that Simpson was never the victim of British arrogance. Instead, he was the single most vital, stabilizing asset Dwight Eisenhower possessed during the most dangerously fractured period of the alliance. In a war commanded by towering, fragile personalities, fierce nationalistic pride, and the relentless demand for favorable press, pure, uninterrupted military momentum was never enough. The alliance itself had to survive. General William Simpson achieved the impossible, not by fighting his allies, but by quietly absorbing their friction. It leaves us with one enduring lesson about the bitter necessity of compromise. True leadership often requires burying your own ego to keep a massive, volatile military machine from tearing itself apart. William Simpson never wrote a vindictive memoir or chased post-war fame, choosing instead to let the operational records speak for themselves. His legacy proves that in a devastating global conflict dominated by monumental, clashing egos, the most successful field commander was often the one who simply refused to have one.